Everybody, welcome to WTF Hammer Underworlds. All right, today's video I'm going to be revisiting my Season 4 tier list, which I discussed in another video. The link's going to be in the description below. In light of the new FAR list, the new errata that have been released as of June 2021 by Games Workshop, because definitely has shaken things up a little bit in my tier list because of the restricted cards that are faction specific and all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to make some modifications to my tier list in light of this, and we're just going to jump right into it. So if you guys check my previous video, you'll see that my final tier list basically looked like this, with Kanan's Reapers in first place in the S tier and Steelheart's Champions in last place in the D tier. Really just the weakest warband across all meta, in my opinion. And all the other warbands fall somewhere in the middle. You can check that out here. Check out that video to find out my justifications. And some of these warbands have recently had some new restricted cards added to their list. There's been some errata that got released regarding Molog and Kagra's Ravagers that also affect their effectiveness. So I'm just going to systematically go through each warband that got affected and how I feel that they should be repositioned if they are getting repositioned based on this June 2021 update. So starting with Lady Harrow's Mournflight, who had an additional card added to the restricted list. I think it's One Will. I forget the name of it. But adding that card certainly is necessary. But I would say that I don't think it's super impactful to their overall position in the tier list. They have a few considerations to make now since they have two cards that are basically guaranteed from their faction-specific cards to be added to their deck. So it reduces their universal options to one. But I don't think it's significant enough to knock them out of the S tier, even put them behind Morgoth's Crushes or Thorns of the Briar Queen, because they still have amazing fighter cards, amazing objective and power cards in general, and deserve second place only behind Kanan's Reapers. Morgoth's also received two new restricted cards added to their list, but similarly, I decided not to move their position because I still think that they are incredibly effective and that they will be incredibly effective in the meta to come because their fighter cards are amazing. They have a strong push mechanic. Their objective cards aren't necessarily the greatest, but they're just masters of the primacy counter in terms of just getting it and not being able to get it from them because they're so freaking tough. These guys are just beasts. And even with the restricted cards, I think that they are still beasts. They just have fewer universal options, which I think is good to help balance things out, but I still put them as third place overall when looking at all the seasons 1 to 4 warbands. The next warband that had a modification was Hrothgorn's Man Trappers. But I mean, for me, this modification was completely negligible. It's the Arm of Everwinter, where they score a glory if they flip an objective token or remove an objective token from the battlefield. And that card wasn't amazing to begin with, and now it's just sort of arbitrarily restricted. I don't think it was necessary to restrict that card, and I don't think it's going to affect very much how Hrothgorn perform in general in this meta or in metas to come. Rippa's similarly had a restricted card, which definitely hurts them. I didn't feel it was necessary to restrict it because I don't think Rippa's is such a powerhouse that they needed to have a restricted card. But their cards in general are still solid objective cards, solid power cards across the board. Having this additional restricted card obviously does limit some of their universal options, but not enough for me to put them behind Drepper's Wraith Creepers or anything like that. Which brings me to Molog, who had many modifications, one restricted card, and important errata changes to his special ability on his inspired side, which has resulted in me pushing him down 5 spots just behind Starblood Stalkers. He was just ahead of Headcracker's Mad Mob before this because, he's just less vicious. His ability to kill is less. He already didn't have good objective cards. His power cards were okay. They weren't the greatest, but mostly it was Molog who was to be feared with his 7 wounds and his 2 charge actions and his big damage and his scything. And now that that's been sort of reined in a little bit, Molog is just a lesser version of himself. And then there's the restricted card to just add insult to injury. I still put him ahead of Zarbag's Gits because they give away primacy token very easily, and they give away glory points very easily, and they themselves don't have the greatest cards, especially objective cards. I definitely put Molog's Mob down the list behind the majority of the new Season 4 warbands that were released. And that brings me to Kagra's Ravagers, whose Inspire mechanic has become easier to achieve. I mean, it's in beta testing, but if we assume that this is going to be a permanent change, it definitely does give these guys a boost. Not a significant enough boost, in my opinion, to put them ahead of Grashrax's Despoilers or Morgwaith's Blade Coven, because those guys have very good objective cards and power cards in general, although they are fairly squishy and do give away the primacy token because of that. I still think Kagra's is generally less effective than them. And although they may inspire more easily, their whole desecration mechanic is still not a good mechanic. That whole mechanic should have been completely revamped to make it actually useful and not so easy to just remove desecration tokens off of objectives that were hard to desecrate in the first place. So I'm keeping them where they are. I definitely like the improvement. I don't think it's enough to justify changing their position on my tier list. And that basically does it for all the June 2021 FAR list updates, as well as the errata. But after making my last video for Season 4 tier list, which as I mentioned is in the description, I received several comments and I took some time to reflect really mostly on the impact of the primacy token, not only on those warbands who are good at achieving it and benefiting from it, but also on those warbands who are specifically harmed because of its introduction. Those squishier warbands who can't take hits at all, who are knocked out of action from a single attack, who just give away the primacy token just by nature of their weak fighters. And I've tried to make a few adaptations to this list based on that, starting with Skate's Wild Hunt, who I originally had just ahead of Ripa's Snarlfangs. And after thinking about it, after playing these guys many times, I played these guys a lot of times, even before making that tier list, I do have to admit that these guys are pretty vulnerable. They're pretty squishy. They only inspire in an end phase after they make a charge action, which usually puts them in a dangerous space where they get taken out of action before they can even inspire, because most of these guys have 2 or 3 wounds. And even when inspiring, the majority of these guys just keep either a 1 dodge or a 1 shield characteristic, which after reassessing and reconsidering and keeping in mind that these guys still are hunters and they still, do decent damage with decent accuracy and have tons of movement, allowing them to hit basically any unit on the map. They're definitely a good warband. I decided to put them lower on the list. I put them ahead of Miari's Purifiers because I don't feel that they are much squishier than Miari's, who just have 3 wounds across the board. Definitely not squishier than Starblood Stalkers either, or Zarbag. So I basically put them in this position just after the Dread Pageant, but before Miari's, mostly on account of their squishiness, their inability to really effectively gain the primacy token because they don't put out too much damage, and the unfortunate reality that they give up the primacy token very easily. And for similar reasons, I've looked at the Sepulchral Guard and decided to move them back on the tier list as well. So right now, as you can see, they're just ahead of the Spike Claws Swarm. I mostly put them there with the introduction of the new Raise counter mechanic. But in all honesty, I'm not even sure if that Raise counter mechanic is going to remain in effect when Season 3 rotates out. I'm hoping the Arena Mortis pack will continue to be sold, sort of like the Essentials card pack, and that new board and those new rules will constantly be in rotation, but I'm not sure if they are. I'm also not sure if the Raise counter will ever be reintroduced again in the future, but mostly I decided to move these guys back just because they are very squishy. Lots of 2 wound units. Everybody has 1 dodge. Their damage output is not exceptional, so they do not gain the primacy token easy at all. They give it away very easily. I decided to move them just behind Magor's Fiends, 3 spots back, because as I take a big overall look at things, I just think that across all meta seasons 1, 2, 3, 4, probably the ones to come, Sepulchral Guard will generally perform less well than Magor's Fiends, especially in a post-primacy rule Warhammer Underworlds reality. And the final change I'm making to my tier list really isn't related to anything new. It's not related to primacy token. It's not related to this new FAR list and errata that just got released. It's just based on my own reflections of a particular warband that I really like to play, and maybe subjectively I have rated too harshly because I really hate 2 of their fighters, Narvia and Tura. So I decided to reevaluate Eyes the 9 and move them up to C tier, but at the back of C tier, because in hindsight they do have certain versatile options that other warbands don't. Vortimus can summon the Blue Horror, who in and of itself is a very interesting fighter who takes an attack and doesn't get taken out of action, but rather swaps for the Brimstone Horror. Vortimus is a good spellcaster. And although he does really carry his team, which is a big impediment for the team, because if Vortimus gets taken out of action, the game is basically lost. I mean, there are other warbands that also have that sort of situation, like Sepulchral Guard and Grimwatch, which I did rate not so low on this tier list, especially Grimwatch. So I feel that maybe I was being a little bit too harsh to Eyes of the 9, who also have fairly good movement and teleport mechanics, although their objective cards are horrible. But anyway, I decided to move them up to C tier, but to the end of C tier, just behind Godsworn Hunt. They're better than I had initially rated them, and it's my intention to make this tier list as accurate to the reality of Warhammer Underworlds across all meta as possible. Obviously, this is subjective, it's my opinion, but I'm doing my best here. It's really a living list that I do plan to modify as I play more, as I see things play out, as I get suggestions. I am willing to change things as well. So this is currently how I am seeing the effectiveness of seasons 1 to 4 Warband seem to play out. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, please comment below. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and I hope that you all have a nice day.